Okay, it's Frances Ringwood here with Resource Magazine. I'm talking today with Stan Javaskiewicz, who is the founder of Envitech Solutions, an environmental engineering company. Stan, thanks for agreeing to see us here today. Can I start off by asking what Envitech's areas of expertise are within the environmental landfill construction field, and what is your experience in the industry?
Well, first of all, Envitech is a sprightly 13-year-old company and was formed to specifically focus on environmental engineering and again specifically in waste management and mining waste management and mining pollution control. So those are broadly the sectors we're in. In terms of waste management, we operate right across the board in general waste management, in other words, waste that goes into municipal landfill sites, and hazardous waste management. My personal experience, I have been a consultant for many years. I've basically been in waste management for something like 31 years. And my training was that of a civil engineer specializing in geotechnical engineering. And it was through the geotechnical engineering that I got into landfill engineering. And that was looking at remediating sites that were polluting the environment, and then also using the geotechnical expertise to locate and site new landfill sites and design them appropriately. The rest of my experience basically then moved into landfill gas management, which is one of the major emissions that you get out of a landfill site. There are two emissions that you get. The one is leachate, which is what causes groundwater pollution if it's not controlled. And then, of course, landfill gas, which is an air emission and can create problems in terms of air quality. And if it's trapped in a particular environment, it can be explosive. So there have been loss of life before on projects where contractors, for instance, have not taken appropriate due care, and landfill gases exploded and killed people. Then I've had a spell with the contracting side of the business. I was the CEO of one of the major waste companies in South Africa for a couple of years. After that, they reverted back to a consulting role, and then ever since then I've been involved in general waste management, hazardous waste, clinical waste. This is healthcare risk waste. And for my sins, I was also involved in the Institute of Waste Management for many years, which came with all its little problems, especially at the time we had the saga with illegally dumped medical waste. So we've had quite a broad experience, but as I said, our focus is in that area. On the mining sector, most of our work has been done in the coal mining sector, where we design pollution control systems. As you can appreciate, coal mines it's a bit of a dirty business, especially when you're crushing and washing.
You've got to get the waste
processing
materials
coal
up from under the ground, yes.
And then the discard or the disposal of what is called discard, and the other products such as slurry that comes out of the washing process. So all of this has to be properly designed so that we don't have pollution of the environment. And if you look at the legislation today, mine waste and mining products are all included in the definition of waste under the Waste Act. So hence that involvement in the mining sector, because in designing barrier systems or lining systems, very similar to what we do in waste management on landfills.
So when you get a slurry pond, for example, that's similar to the sort of things you do for a leachate pond.
Yes.
But we're talking today on enhancing the useful life of landfills. And I know you have significant experience on probably on all of the major projects in this area in the country. And I think for our audience, I'd like to ask, why is there a need to extend the useful life of landfills?
Well, this is becoming quite tricky in terms of locating new landfill sites and developing new landfill sites. Because ever since I've been in the business, there's always been this problem with not in my backyard, where people don't want these facilities built in their backyard or near their backyard. And then there's which was always referred to as the NIMBY syndrome. And there's a number of other acronyms as well that we could delve into. But fundamentally, landfill sites that are reaching the end of their life cause a problem in the sense that if you look at the city of Johannesburg, for instance, they take a vast amount of waste every year. And if they run out of airspace in their landfills, they're going to be sitting with a huge problem. So now you look at, and I'm using Johannesburg as an example.
It's
now
the
you've got a
biggest
big
metro.
metro. You don't walk down the street and find an open piece of ground that you can now develop a new landfill site. So what's been happening is that with the development of big cities, metros, the encroachment on the city and urbanization, you've got firstly your informal developments that eventually becomes formalized in the longer term. So now when you look for a new landfill site, you have to go much further out, away from the city center, to go and look for appropriate land that can be developed for landfill. The problem with that is that your haulage distances now start increasing. So the cost of transporting the waste to your landfill becomes more expensive. And cities now have to budget for these huge expenses. And an example of this is the city of Durban. Many years ago, they recognized the need for a new regional landfill site. The Bosasa Road site, which is located, I would not say in the middle of Durban, but certainly very close, on the banks of the Umgeni River, that site was earmarked to be closed a few years ago. Right now it's still operational, but it's probably got very little time left. But what the city of Durban did was they recognized the fact that they needed to locate a new landfill site. And at the time, this is many years ago, at the time we were doing a landfill gas project there. And one of the advantages of extracting gas out of a landfill is that you precipitate settlement in the landfill and you regain some of that airspace that gets consumed. And it was a significant amount. And so Durban embarked on extracting gas way back, I would say as far back as 1996. And they saw the immediate return in that it was giving them additional landfill airspace on the same site. But nevertheless, that was not going to last. So they embarked upon a process to look for a new regional site, which they did. And this was many years later developed, and that is known as the Buffels Dry landfill. Durban now sits with a situation where all the waste going into the Bosasa Road site, and we're talking here of anything between 2,500 and 3,500 tons a day, now has to be relocated to Buffels Dry. And this will then go through a transfer station, because you cannot use your normal collection vehicles to travel those distances. It's an additional 36 kilometers to that new site. So this indicates the problems that you face when you have to develop new landfills. You have to go further and further out.
And the cost of fuel, and you'll get wear and
And
tear
that's
on
the whole
vehicles,
cost
and
of
that all
transport.
comes out of the municipal budget. So
That's correct, yes.
And my next question is, what was the expected life of a landfill built about 30 years ago?
It's actually interesting because some of the cities had rather large landfills. When you say 30 years ago, that's as long as I've actually been in the business. And at the time, the average municipality, you probably find that they were looking at 10, 15 to 20 years at the most. That was always a problem for me personally, because I could see that into the future, you needed to build a facility that could run for at least 30 to 40 years, because that then becomes much more cost effective. If you've got to build a new landfill site every 10 years or even every 15 years, the cost of doing that is just exorbitant, because you're going to outlay the capital cost on a new landfill facility. You're going to probably, but you see, municipalities
New liners as well.
Municipalities don't operate on a business model that the private sector would be doing. Because the private sector, if they built a landfill site, they would want to get their money back, and they would want a short return period. In other words, 2, 3, 4 years before they start breaking even. And then, of course, after that, at regular intervals, they will be putting capex back into the project, because the trend is to develop your landfill facility in a modular fashion. In other words, you build cells. So as one cell gets full, you have to build another cell. And those cells, on average, take about 2 years to fill.
What is the expected lifespan of landfills today, and what's changed in the mentality of municipalities and other people who manage landfill sites?
Well, I think as I've just explained, if you're looking at a business model for running a landfill and you're in the private sector, then you're going to make sure that you're going to get a landfill site that's going to last you at least 30 years. So you're now talking about 30 to 50 years. If you look at the Holfontein site, which I was the original designer of, we designed that site for 30 years. And that 30 years it's almost there. And if you go and look at Holfontein, I don't think it's got, in terms of the original footprint, it's got a lot of life left in it. The new site that we've just developed at Vlakfontein near Vereniging, also a hazardous waste site, that has been projected at a 30-year lifespan as well. But I think what you've got to understand here on this new one is that the client has made provision for treatment of waste. Because of the changing legislation over the last 30 years, and particularly the last 10 years, we have to put more emphasis on minimizing waste, more emphasis on recycling waste, this even with hazardous waste, and of course treatment of hazardous waste. So it's not acceptable anymore to, for instance, to go and start putting hazardous liquids into landfill sites anymore like it used to be. So by doing those treatment processes and by taking out the recyclables, you automatically start extending the life of your site. And so that is why we now find, if it's a private company, they will certainly not look at anything less than 30 years. If it's a municipality and it's a forward-looking municipality like the city of Durban, their Buffels dry site will probably last them for 75 to 100 years. And that's really the horizon that they should be looking at.
Okay, that's where you get your maximum return on investment.
That's right.
Okay, and given there's been a lot of legislative changes governing environmentally compliant landfills, how has that changed between sort of the past and now? And are there ways of retrofitting existing landfills so that, well, I say retrofitting, but are there technologies you can put on site?
Yeah, legislation, that's a bit of a prickly subject because I maintain that we have probably some of the best environmental legislation in South Africa. And with that goes obviously the waste management legislation, the Waste Act, and of course the regulations that go with that pertain to barrier system design. It's a pretty high standard. The problem now is that it's very easy to do a design, get it approved by the authorities, but if the client does not actually implement it, then you're back to square one. And the problem here mainly lies with the municipalities. I think it's common knowledge. If you're sitting with something like 86% of your municipalities are dysfunctional, you can imagine that extends down to the management of their landfills. And in many cases, even though those landfills have been properly designed, properly built with liner systems, the problem lies with the management that goes in and the people that are put in there to run those sites. Not properly trained, a lack of adequate supervision from above. So you will find, and I can take you to many landfills around the country to show you that most of them do not comply with the legislation. Government puts a lot of emphasis on hazardous waste. So you then find that the private sector, who are basically the people who own hazardous landfill sites, get most of the attention. So those hazardous waste sites will be scrutinized by the DEA, Department of Water Affairs, and of course our friends the Green Scorpions. So there's a lot of pressure on them and a lot of pressure on them to comply. Now, not only does the pressure come from a legislative point of view, but many companies that generate the waste that go to those sites demand compliance with environmental legislation, because many of those companies trade internationally, and that type of compliance is one of the major requirements in international trade when you're dealing with companies, particularly in Europe, for instance. So that is where the pressure also comes from the generators of the waste, because they want to make sure that where their waste is going, that it's safe and adequately disposed of. Many years ago, I got involved there, and this site was located on the bank of a river with another tributary on the other side of the landfill. The landfill was built on an old meander. Now, a meander is a river that used to meander and filled up with sand and silt, so you can imagine there's no clay there, so any leachate that gets into that material will just flow away.
Straight into, yeah.
And the concern was that this landfill site, which covers a 30-hectare site, or footprint, by the way, was going to create problems in terms of pollution in the Mgani River and the surrounding area. So we designed a system that essentially cut off all seepage from the site, a subsoil drainage system that cut off that seepage. We built berms around the landfill, we capped it, and we then designed a capping system for the landfill. But the novel thing in our capping design was that it then became the base for the new landfill. So if you can imagine a 30-hectare landfill, you now have to go and find a new landfill site somewhere to replace that one, because if you're going to seal it off, close it off, and rehabilitate it, you've got to go and find a new landfill somewhere else. And that, as I explained earlier on, that is a major problem. So we looked at, and my approach has always been to see what is the most or the best I can do with an existing site. So how can I transform an existing site into something that is going to benefit the community and take us, into the future. So the city of Pietermaritzburg accepted our proposals, and we designed the site, and we put up what we call a piggyback landfill. And to my knowledge, I think that's the first piggyback landfill that was designed in South Africa, totally piggyback. You do get other landfills in South Africa that have got piggyback designs, but those are what I call a partial piggyback, in other words, where the new landfill is built against the old one.
And did you get the idea from reading international case studies, or was it just something you...
Well, I think yes, the concept of piggyback is not new in the sense that we came up with the idea. We obviously have seen projects in the US, in Europe, where piggyback landfills were designed, especially in valley landfills. And we thought, well, how can we adapt that or adopt it and use it in that particular context? Our concern was that we had, in a landfill, it's a complex body of waste and subject to settlement and stability issues. You get differential settlement. In other words, the whole landfill doesn't settle uniformly. And you put drainage systems in to manage your leachate management. Now, your leachate, if your drainage systems become blocked, or if you get differential settlement and your leachate systems don't adequately drain out the leachate, then you develop problems. So we designed the system in such a way so that when the old landfill started settling because of the weight of the new landfill above it, that part of the system was the lowest part of the leachate management system, so that the leachate would forever drain in that direction. So those are the little things one had to bring into play, and so that to ensure that years later, when the entire landfill has now been developed, that all your systems are still functioning.
Thanks. And what innovative technology is available on the local and international markets for extending the useful life of landfills? I know you told me a little bit about, there's a site in Olifantsfontein where you have a system.
Well, I think it's almost becoming imperative in South Africa today that besides the landfill operation, you have to have an adequate system to manage leachate. That is one of the major things. And it's also becoming pretty obvious that, especially if you're dealing with hazardous sites, that leachate, you cannot just dump it anywhere, you can't put it into the sewer system. You've actually got to put in a treatment plant to treat it before you get final disposal of that, the effluent. The other major item is landfill gas. Now, if you extract landfill gas, and even if you only burn it off in a flare, then your major benefit is that you get consolidation of your landfill, you get settlement in the landfill. If you imagine on average 45% of your waste stream is organic, and it's all the organic material that degrades microbiologically, and that degenerates into basically gas, carbon, and water. That water contributes to your leachate problem, and of course the gas becomes a problem on its own as well. The gas in itself is methane. If you're going to be extracting the gas under steady state conditions, you will find that in landfills your methane is around about 50%, carbon dioxide is around about 48%, and the other 2% is made up of lovely little smelly gases like H2S, you get mercaptans and a few other.
And the methane
gases.
is, of course, a massive contributor towards greenhouse gases.
Yes. So if you look at CDM projects, Cleaner Development Mechanism project, and generating CERs, your carbon emission reductions, that became the driving force in South Africa to start gas extraction. Although we sold the idea to the city of Durban many years ago to extract gas and burn it off just to recoup airspace. So if I come back to my 45% of the organics, if you picture 40% of that 45% degrading completely, you can imagine you regaining 40% of your airspace that you will be getting back, and that then prolongs the life of your landfill. So those are one of the things that you can look at. In Europe, this is where we learned about gas extraction, but obviously in Europe, because of the energy question, many years, way before us, they decided that burning gas was not just an option, they had to do something with it. And of course, they turned to energy production. So in Europe, you'll find local community heating schemes, centralized heating schemes using that gas, or generating electricity from reciprocating engines. So they try and get all that energy back and use it. In South Africa, we traditionally had the saying that electricity was cheap, and when I would say in the late 86, 88, when we tried to look at doing it here, we just could not compete with Eskom in terms of what those costs were for generating electricity. So we then focused on the concept of recouping some of our airspace, in other words, getting that settlement in the landfill so that we get that airspace back. The other advantage of extracting gas from a landfill is that it stabilizes the landfill a lot quicker. If you had to just walk away from a landfill once it's complete, it'll continue generating gas, it'll continue generating leachate. So those two items you've got to manage. And the landfill will never be stable. It'll always pose a threat unless you do something about it.
And when you say threat, you mean explosions, fires?
Well, not necessarily that, but it'll still pose a threat from generating leachate and the potential pollution of groundwater sources or surface water sources, because very often, if it's an above-ground landfill, the leachate can come seeping out the sides, so that gets into a water stream. And then gas, as I said earlier on, if it gets into an enclosed environment, it can create an explosive situation. Landfills, as I said, if you walk away and don't do anything, they will just sit there and quietly, it's like an anaerobic digester. It'll just quietly sit there and cook away, creating more leachate, creating more landfill gas. And so the site itself is not stable, and that can take up to 50 years. If you look at the literature, you will see the generation of landfill gas peaks more or less at the time of closure of the site, and then after that rapidly declines. And that period that it declines over, and over which period you can get useful use of that gas, is probably around about 20-25 years. After that, there's not enough gas being generated to usefully use in a gas engine or something else like that. But it is still generating gas. And it's been shown that some landfill sites would carry on for anything from 50 to 80 years, still generating gas, but even though it's a small amount. You'll find that most licenses that are issued now, permits in the past, internationally you'll find our experience is that they have the same problem. And what they do is that, but you see, this was all put in place before active degassing and these sort of things became the vogue. They put they made the owner of the landfill responsible for that landfill site for the next 30 years after closure. And it's because of those problems, the generation of leachate, the gas production. Because if you leave a site on its own, while it's generating gas, and you've done nothing to extract that gas, you will eventually find your rehabilitation starts failing. The vegetation that you plant starts dying off, because that landfill gas eventually rises up to the surface of the landfill and gets into the root zone and starts killing off the vegetation. So, and you will also generate cracks in the capping, and then that will allow gas to escape as well. So those are the things that happen if you don't actively get in and sort out the leachate and the landfill gas.
What facilities are being built on site to facilitate these technologies? So I'm thinking of, recycling sort of recycling centres. Are there sort of flaring stations?
Yes, I think if we look at extending the life of the landfill site, the obvious issue is to look at minimizing the waste going into the site. And as I explained earlier on, for instance, with the Vlakfontein project, that the design there is that treatment plants will, over a period of time, be put in place. A MRF, a materials recycling facility, will be put in place, so that waste streams coming in, and which can be effectively taken out, recycled, treated, or reused, that then reduces the net input into the landfill, and that obviously then extends the life of the landfill. So the obvious things that can be done is putting in treatment plants, putting in, and one of the most obvious ones is compost.
Oh, okay. I don't think we do that very often in this country, do we?
Some places do, but with varying success. But again, you see, it's not properly managed and thought through. But it's certainly very successful in other countries. But Cape Town, as far as I know, have a composting program where they've got transfer stations where, for instance, garden waste. So if you take all your garden waste out of your waste stream and you put it through a chipping process, you can then ship that off to a company that produces compost. So those are, and some of the cities are looking at that. The city of Johannesburg has had a composting project for many years. So that is one of the, and let me get back to two items which are probably the biggest consumers of airspace when it comes to general waste. One is your organic waste, which is garden waste, and the other one is builder's rubble. And builder's rubble just consumes airspace, and really there's no return for it, even from a financial perspective, because the minute you start charging too much for the disposal of builder's rubble, those people or contractors that bring that material to site, they will go and dump it illegally somewhere. And I'm sure you don't have to drive very far around Johannesburg and you will find illegal waste that's been dumped. And a lot of it is builder's rubble. So if you can put in a facility to handle builder's rubble, and what I'm talking about here is a crushing facility. So you put in crushing plant. I know that the city of Joburg has been looking at it. I think one of the best examples I've ever seen was in Canada, in Montreal, where they were working in an old quarry in the middle of the city, and they were running the city's waste into this quarry. They designed a landfill site there. But when the waste arrived, you had facilities to take recyclables, paper, plastics, cardboard, facilities to handle tins and glass. They had a facility that would handle all the builder's rubble that would come in. It would be crushed, graded, separated into different stockpiles. And the city's engineering department came back and took that material and reused it in the city for construction purposes.
For like backfilling and...
Backfilling of trenches and all that, yeah, and even building roads. If you take concrete, one of the biggest problems is concrete, when it gets dumped on a landfill, has got reinforcing steel in it. You can now get crushing machines that will crush that concrete, but you can extract that steel. And the machine's not damaged because it's been designed for that. That steel then can be recycled by putting it with scrap metal and selling it back into the scrap metal industry. So there's a lot of material that can be handled and can be taken out of the waste stream.
Okay, and my next question is, what are some of the different types of landfills, and how does this have a bearing on the idea of landfill space shortages?
I think your biggest problem is municipal waste, which is broadly classified as general waste. If we talk about different types, I would say basically you have two types of landfill. One is general waste and the other one is hazardous waste. In general waste, if you go to some of the very small municipalities, yes, you'll get a small landfill site. But when you go up to the bigger cities and the metros, you will then get very big landfill sites. So it's really a question of scale, and the problems that you have on those sites, which, as I said earlier, goes back to management, supervision, inadequate resources, lack of budget, all these lovely things, and utilizing the right equipment to operate the site. That sort of prevails across the board. However, the metros are the ones that have got the most money, so they are the ones that are able to afford putting the right people in place and the right equipment and to operate the sites more effectively. So in general, most of your metros operate their sites quite well. There are standout sites such as eThekwini. Probably, I would rate them probably the best in the country. There's Cape Town and Johannesburg to a degree. The other cities, well, they've got some major problems with their sites. If we come to hazardous waste, again now we're dealing with the private sector. So they have to be on their toes, they have to manage those sites properly, they have to, because they are the ones that will probably stand the highest risk of generating odors and the like, which obviously the local communities won't like, especially if they're located close to a local community. And so now the trend is that also with those particular sites is that the private sector is looking at locating them far away from communities where they can. For anything, the Vlakfontein site is an exception. That was developed, that site, the concept of that site was developed on the basis of what happened at Marion Do Landfill in Durban. The Marion Do Landfill is a registered nature conservancy, and when it was decided that we would follow a similar route with the Vlakfontein hazardous site, because that would be a first, we then discovered that the local community, which consists of small farmers and small holdings, had already formed a registered conservancy themselves. So we found ourselves now in the middle of their conservancy. So we had to now join with them, and so we are going to have quite a few people looking over our shoulders there, making sure that we stay on our toes and that site is properly operated.
Okay, so if you run a site well, what you're saying is that you don't have to have it far away, you don't have to have those extra transportation costs, it's just a matter of managing the site properly.
Well, as I tell many people and lots of my clients, you go to the Marion Do Landfill site, you will see probably one of the best run sites in South Africa. We have had clients flying from Windhoek, Cape Town, East London, all going there to go and have a look at the site. And you know, we still have an involvement there through the landfill gas project, but we designed that site and it was built some 16, 17 years ago. And the nearest house or the community is something like 200 meters from the landfill. And the person who lives in that house is the chairman of the monitoring committee that monitors what goes on at that landfill site. So you can imagine they really have to be on their toes so that they don't upset the local community. And that's a prime example and probably one of the best I could offer.
Thanks. And I know this is a difficult question to answer, but ballpark figures, how much does the average municipal solid waste landfill site cost to construct?
I looked at this. It is a tricky one, but if you look at the latest legislation, if I look at the costs that we've incurred at Roundhill Landfill, which is near Buffalo City, that first project we've recently concluded, that's an existing site that we had to turn around. It was a total disaster. It was burning, the waste had been dumped everywhere, the liners weren't properly, in other words, they'd landfilled over the footprint of the liner system. So we had to recover all of this and build a temporary cell, and then go on to build 2 new cells. And that tender is currently out. But if I look at the costs of what we've incurred there, and I look at some of the other projects that we've been involved in, depending on the size of the landfill, you could be talking anything between 80 and 120 million rand to build a decent landfill site. If I had to build a new landfill site today for the city of Johannesburg, I would probably think it would be in the region of 120 to 150 million. That's new infrastructure, new landfill cells, all the lining systems, because of the new barrier regulations. Yeah, that's probably the region that we look at.
Sure, thank you. And how many years does it take to, well, you've answered this, it takes about 30 years to rehabilitate a landfill site, is that?
Yes, I think that question, yeah, a little bit tricky, because we have a philosophy, and it doesn't always, client doesn't necessarily always follow it, but we have a thing called rising green wall. It's something that I learned in Europe many years ago when a landfill has been developed, and particularly if it's a landfill that's in a valley, or even above grade. If you start going above ground with your landfill, you should start your rehabilitation process as you go along, so that when you get to the top of your landfill and your landfill is now full, all you have to rehabilitate is the top or the surface. So in other words, all your side slopes have already been rehabilitated. So the time and the cost it takes is a lot less. I would say in general, the real physical part of it is probably 2 to 3 years to conclude on the rehabilitation of a landfill site. But the long-term issues such as settlement on the site, because in terms of the permit, you have to look after it for 30 years. And the things that you look at when you come back on a periodic annual basis is to look at settlement on the site, how your drainage systems are working, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep as much rainfall, precipitation, and any other stormwater flows away from your landfill and off your landfill, so that you minimize the amount of water going into the landfill. Remember, any water that is able to seep into the landfill eventually becomes leachate. That then comes out the bottom in the leachate system, and you've still got leachate to treat. So that's why you have to make sure you have to maintain all your drainage systems. You have to maintain the cap that goes on the landfill. Your differential settlement will provide areas on top of the landfill where water can be trapped. So you then come back and you have to do some earthworks and fill that in and make sure that you don't get that. So yes, 2 to 3 years, the physical part of it, and then a monitoring exercise for the next 30 years.
Okay, and I suppose we're sort of coming to the end, but what do you think the single most effective way to extend the useful life of a landfill is?
Well, besides the recycling, diversion of waste, minimization of waste going, when people talk about minimizing waste, they normally talk about it being minimized at the production end or at the user end. I talk about minimizing waste going into the landfill. And there it's all those recycling options that I was talking about. The only other real major way of extending the life of the landfill is through engineering. And as I mentioned earlier on, the piggyback option, one needs to look at, for instance, if you've got a above grade landfill, your license will normally limit you to a certain height. So you need to look at that and say, well, can I go higher? My landfill, it would have probably settled 2 or 3 meters in the years it's been operating. So maybe I've already got 2 meters or 3 meters I can utilize, and then go vertically and go higher. Or if there's sufficient land around the site, you can then build a piggyback landfill, but where you build the landfill adjacent to the existing, but it leans against the old site. So you try and maximize the amount of airspace that you can generate in your design. The one example I mentioned earlier on was the New England Road landfill. And then the Round Hill landfill, when we did the turnaround strategy there in the last 2 years. And when I talk about rehabilitation of the Round Hill landfill, I'm not talking about closing it and rehabilitating it, I'm talking about rehabilitating a disaster. We have found that we were able to gain a lot of airspace in terms of the way we designed it.
So you're sort of saying that Well, recycling and reuse is obviously the best way, but from an
That's your first
engineering
option.
perspective, it's that initial design that
Yes.
you. Okay. And my final question is, can you describe a case study? You mentioned Marion Hill, where Envitech sort of built an optimal site where the client saved a lot of money, where the landfill had a much longer than average lifespan.
Marion Hill's a site that I built, designed and built when I was in another consultancy. We still have an involvement there through the landfill gas project, but I would say probably the Round Hill site is one of our flagship projects at the moment, down near East London. And and then Vlakfontein, I think, is going to head that way as well. So I think,
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Sure, thanks.